Emanuel Swedenborg was a scientist. He started off as a scientist. He lived in the 1700s. His father was a Lutheran bishop, so he grew up Lutheran. Spent his young life and his career, he was kind of one of the last Renaissance men. Like, he sort of studied everything, knew everything about everything. He invented a flying machine. He studied anatomy. He was curious about learning everything, and his motivation was really a spiritual one. He was looking for the seat of the soul, kind of in the body, in the world. So that was his life up until his 50s, and then when he was about 55, he really started through dreams, and he has one of the most extensive dream journals that is available. Started his dreams, and it then became kind of deep meditation. And in that going within, he had these very profound spiritual experiences of what the other life was like and what God is like and kind of our place in it. He wrote many, many volumes of his experiences. We call it the Green 30 volumes. And began to publish them anonymously at first and then by his name. And people started to read them. And the people who began to read them were very diverse, but among them were ministers in the Episcopal, or it was the Anglican tradition in England, the Methodist tradition. And those clergymen began to wonder about this teaching and what it was offering and wanting to preach it in their churches and potentially build something new from it. The heart of Swedenborg's vision, while it's very extensive, is that that a new church is coming into the world, that a new way of being in relationship and community was emerging, and he kind of witnessed that and understood it to be a deeper meaning of the story from Revelation of the Holy City descending. So anyway, he declares this new church, but he's doing it from a very mystical perspective, from a very, he's alone in his cottage, furiously having these spiritual experiences and writing about them. He's not a church builder, and but these men were, and so there was a lot of debate and conversation about what to do with these teachings. And among those early conversations actually were artists. William Blake was among the first meeting of people considering what to do. And William Blake, the great mystic artist, was very much against forming a formalized church, a new organization. So he kind of showed up for the first few meetings, and I was like, yeah, I'm not into this. But the other clergymen, in part, I'm sure some of them were probably tried to share what Swedenborg was saying within their churches and weren't allowed. But whatever I wish I could be a fly on the wall to know what those deliberations were like. But the decision was made to form an organization called the Church, the New Church, the Church of the New Jerusalem, that would seek to continue to worship, build community, but now with these added teachings that Swedenborg brought to understand the Bible and to understand God and to understand ourselves. And so the church started in England and quickly moved also to the United States, other parts of Europe. I think Swedenborg certainly is the primary thing that makes us distinct, and that we look to his mystical vision as a kind of primary source for understanding the spiritual life. At this point in our evolution, there are different branches of Swedenborgians. There are some that really see Swedenborg's writing not just as a mystical vision, but as a revelation that really needs to be. In one branch of the church, Swedenborg's writings are considered a third testament, like another part of the biblical text, and so they're treated very kind of given that solidity of biblical scholarship. Our branch that I'm a part of has a bit more of a liberal perspective that, we definitely hold Swedenborg as central, but we see his vision as his vision, seen through his eyes, his experience, his formation, 17th century, being a European white male in 17th century. We understand that, and so we kind of are looking for the essence of his vision, and we believe that what he was seeing, other people probably saw too, that there's been a change that's occurred all over the world over the last few hundred years around how people relate to God, relate to themselves, and relate to the church. And we're kind of curious about all of that unfolding. Most of the really influential people who have been influenced by Swedenborg have kind of remained on the sidelines. The most important person that, to me personally, and I think to the world, was Helen Keller. She was introduced to Swedenborg's writings when she was in her teenage years by a gentleman named John Hitz, who was a good friend to her. They were very close. He would transcribe his writings so that she could read them directly. But also, he would teach her the ideas of correspondences, which was also very central to Swedenborg's vision, that everything in nature corresponds to a spiritual reality, just like everything in the Bible corresponds to a spiritual reality. And so they would go on long walks, and he would talk to her about God in nature. And she was really converted. I found a list of things that were in her room after she died, and there were a couple of Swedenborg's works that were there. She wrote a book called My Religion about her Swedenborgian faith. So she was very devout, and yet she was never a member of a denomination. She never participated. That we could wonder about those reasons. It might have been because of her disability, because of her caretaker, Annie Sullivan, and her teacher was very anti-religion. She was kind of a disaffected Catholic. But for Helen, the idea of the new church was about worship is life, which is part of what Swedenborg is saying, that spirituality is going to become this inner experience, not dictated or mandated by any external church structure or authority. And it calls us to love each other, and it calls us to useful action and service, and particularly to love one another across religious divides, to not stay in our own camps, but to care for the world and care for and understand that God is at work within all traditions and all peoples. And she really lived that. She, as we know, was kind of a global celebrity and able to speak to many different people and communicate and collaborate with people of different races, different ethnicities, and different religions. And she would thank her Swedenborgianism for some of that her faith and her grounding in Swedenborg's writings helped her to see her ability to be of use in the world, even with her limitations, and that her call to be of use was to be in community with a lot of different people. Johnny Appleseed was another outlier. His primary work that we all know him for was planting apple trees and traveling the prairie, but part of what he was doing while he was planting apple trees was handing out Swedenborg's writings. And at the time they were being published as these small pamphlets. So he would kind of tear them apart and leave them with different families. So he too was someone who was really a devotee of Swedenborg's writings. He saw it as a call to action, a call to be a part of the world and to perform his use, and he did that through his planting of apple trees, but also his evangelism by sharing these teachings with people that he met along the way. It was mostly Anglicans that started the tradition, and we really many of our churches still carry that liturgical element into worship. What's so central is this idea that the Bible has this inner meaning that is telling us about the story of our own development and growth. So when we open the Bible, we're signifying that story is available to everyone. And so that kind of holds probably an essence of Swedenborgianism that's really important. But beyond that, it really kind of runs the gamut. Many churches will read from Swedenborg's writings, as we do here, but not all. I think our tradition is, we're only 300 years old compared to some religious traditions. And I think we're still sort of finding ourselves, because there's the work of studying Swedenborg's writings, which is really how it got started. It really was book groups that began, people sitting around reading what he had to say. There's that mission to understand what he was saying. But then there's the mission to live it and how to live it. And as I shared, Helen Keller lived it. Johnny Appleseed. I think we're at a place in our tradition where we're thinking about how to move beyond just understanding what Swedenborg experienced and trying to get clearer on what we're experiencing and the calls God is placing on our hearts to really live this teaching out. And it's easy to kind of get caught in forever trying to understand someone else's perspective. But the reality is, if what he saw was true, then it's true for us. It's God is revealing those insights in us as well, not just in Swedenborg. And that's the mission. That's what I really see as the next step for our tradition, is to realize that we're all kind of, I like the term everyday mystics. That we all are called to love and to grow in love. And Swedenborg gave us a great framework to understand that. And at some point, it's time to step back from trying to understand it for him, and it's time to try to understand it for ourselves. One of our most famous theologians is the Reverend Dr. George Dole. He just died recently. And his son, Andrew Dole, he actually teaches at Amherst in the religion department. And Andrew kind of is in the camp of universal salvation, that eventually everyone is headed towards heaven. They've kind of debated this, because the truth is you can read Swedenborg's writings and it can go either way. Swedenborg says a few things. He says that we're all born for heaven, that all people that's God's plan, that's providence, is that we're all being grown into more loving beings, and that heaven is that state of love and connection. And yet hell is also a real experience, and that hell is a state that we get into when we're only thinking of ourselves. So there's we're sort of born into a sense of me first, then the world, then my neighbor, then God. And that life is about kind of inverting that, so that we think of God first, we think of the whole first, and then we think of the people and our neighbors. Then we think of maybe the structures of the world, then we think of ourselves. So many places in his writings he talks about how hell's really hard to get out of. That when we're caught in our selfish traps, we don't know it, we can't even see beyond it. And so there are many places where he talks about hell being, impossible to escape. But there are other places where he talks about hell being possible to escape, and he talks about God is God of all. God is God of us when we're in our heavenly place and when we're in our hellish place. So I think Swedenborg's kind of very realistic, because I know certainly for me, I can attest to hell being very hard to escape. I meet people all the time who are really trapped in certain false ideas about themselves or others, and it does feel seemingly impossible to escape, and it perpetuates self-harm or harm of others. That being said, we also know there always are those miracle moments when people's perception finally shifts and when something breaks free. And that's, to me, the work of God. That's what God is seeking for all of us. And so there's a bigger whole that is much more perfect. I like to think about the universe from a very grand perspective, and what does hell and heaven have really to do when you think of the universe as a whole, when you think of life evolving over centuries, and when you think of the stars in the sky. All of that is just good, as we hear in Genesis. There's no hell there. But hell comes in, and Swedenborg specifically dictates this. Hell comes in through the human mind. That hell, we create hell through our, all of a sudden we are individuals and we think that we're separate. And so in that development of our sense of separateness, our sense of ego, our sense of our belief that we have control over our lives and that we have power to dominate and subjugate, we've created all that stuff. Animals, and maybe animals have started to create that too. We can debate all of that, but that it really is a self-creation that humankind has gotten into. And Swedenborg would say that was part of the design, that we were given the freedom to turn away from God. And so in that turning away, we've created all kinds of stories that keep us separate from ourselves and from each other. Swedenborg talks a lot about what the spiritual world is like, and that's what a lot of people are attracted to his writings, because they want to know what's heaven like. And one of his books is called Heaven and Hell, and you can pick it up, and there are houses in heaven and communities in heaven and people in loving marriages in heaven, and useful service happening in heaven. And the descriptions of people in hell are often that they're kind of, they think they're super happy because they have all this money around them, but then kind of you step back and you see the emptiness of their experience. So are those eternal states, or was this a one-time view that Swedenborg was given? And it's interesting, the older I get, the more I feel like I notice people around me in this world kind of with that kind of delusion, with that kind of sense of, oh yes, I have to get all of these things and then I'll be okay, but really having just this deep emptiness and lack of connection with other people. I think hell is a easier trap than we even realize. I think the longer I go on my path, the more I see myself trapped in delusions that I'm giving a lot of energy to and giving a lot of stress in, and that are keeping me separate from the people that I love. And so a big part of life is coming to release those illusions. I think you'll get different answers from different Swedenborgians about what this means. My take and my answer is that we are always being shaped. And some of us just we need to be in our illusions for a really, really, really long time before we start to see that there's more to it. But it's very hard for me to imagine that there's this whole realm of life or beings that are just trapped in their own suffering. But I think there's what he describes of the afterlife is there's hell, there's the world of spirits with sort of the central location, and then there's heaven. And the world of spirits is that place where we kind of go when we're still sorting things out. So not everyone is kind of clear on what they're ready for or what they want next. And he's very clear that God is God of all, and that angels are sort of surrounding all of it and holding all of it. So I feel like he gave us a powerful glimpse, maybe a more developed glimpse of how everything works together than we've been given by any other teacher or seer. And it was one gift. And the gist of his message being one of continual growth and expansion, of hell being something human beings create that is not of God. All of that to me points to the idea that we are all being invited, that we're never given up on, that we're constantly surrounded by. He actually points out, he says that we always have at least 2 angels with us, and usually 2 spirits from the world of spirits. So we're kind of constantly held by the spiritual world, but we're held by the spiritual world in a state of freedom, where we have this angelic influence, but we also have these spirits that are yammering at us about all the negative voices that pop through our mind, and we are in freedom. So in my mind, we must always be kept in that freedom, and people in hell are still kept in that freedom. They're still held by angels, even as they are giving in or complacent or more comfortable with the messages of the spirits or the hells. That option, that choice, that love is kind of, it's just always right there as soon as they're ready to look up to it.